Well, we're continuing in Romans, of course. We've been going through Romans for a while, but we're going to continue in the 6th chapter of Romans. And here we're talking about this aspect of conversion. But I think it's important for us to understand, again, what St. Paul is talking about. He goes a little further than yesterday. So yesterday, what we talked about was St. Paul is calling people to turn away from their past lives, and I talked about it in light of my experience of being a drinker. I've never considered myself an alcoholic. I know there were some alcoholics who say, oh, no, that's first step, that's denial. But I never have. As you know, I drink extremely rarely, but I will have a drink. But I never felt I was addicted. I was just pursuing alcohol, and for a lot of other reasons, I think. So, and that's an important distinction, because alcoholism is a disease where the medicine is, or the prescription is not to take the medicine. That's a prescription. It's not to drink. Alcohol is a drug, and therefore the prescription is do not take the drug. I believe I had a drinking problem, so therefore my activity was rooted in this is what I do, but I don't think it was a biological addiction. It was just a drinking problem. One of the things that's key about alcoholism is that it is a biological condition that develops no matter whether you're drinking or not. So, and you know what? Jesus brings this out in terms of sin, and that's why I think, remember, at the time of Jesus, no one understood addiction, and that's why I think sometimes Jesus is speaking about addiction. So let me give you an example. If you are an alcoholic, and you're up to drinking, we'll say 10 beers a day. Okay. And then and if you never quit drinking, when you are 10 years later, you're up to 15 beers a day. But you come to a point prior to reaching that point, you come to an aspect when you're at 10 beers a day of you decide to stop drinking. So you stop. Okay. And then something happens 10 years down the line and you start to drink again, you will within 6 months be up to 15 beers a day, even though you're only drinking 10 when you quit, because that's the nature of the disease. The disease continues even if you are not feeding the disease. So it's a biological condition. And Matt Talbot used to say, kind of a funny story that I can tell on a podcast because I'm not on radio, so I will tell that story. But Matt Talbot used to say, never begrudge someone. I may not have his exact words. He was Irish, so he spoke English. But never begrudge someone who has trouble stopping drinking, because for some, or however he expressed it, it is much easier to get out of hell. And always remember that. Alcoholism is a very serious disease, and it really is a disease. The little story is going to tell you, please pardon me, I am going to say a 4-letter word. Okay, so you're ready. So if you don't want to hear the word, zip forward about 30 seconds. Okay, so I was in the hospital the other day, and there was a poor woman there who happened to see me, and she, speaking, she had a problem with alcohol. And I started to tell her about Matt Talbot. And she says, oh, where can I meet this Matt Talbot? And she'd had a few at that point. So I told her, I said, well, actually, he died, and now he's a saint. I can't remember if he's a saint or a blessed, but he's in heaven. So I said to her, oh, no, he died, so I believe he's a saint. She went, no shit, he's a saint? Yes, indeed. I told you there was, for those of you who didn't go away, I told you there was a 4-letter word in there. And really, really interesting, some of the ministry that I deal with. So keep that in mind. And that also shows you always have to have a sense of humor when you're doing ministry, and when you're living as a person of faith. It's essential. And literally, you cannot be, I don't know if it's still the process now, but it used to be the process. If you didn't have a sense of humor, you couldn't be a saint. So we continue, and we're looking at these powerful words here. We're looking from Romans, and I did a little research here. Now, St. Paul is saying these interesting words to his audience there in Romans. Now, by the way, remember, I don't speak Greek, but I can get by with Latin, so I looked up the Latin from St. Clement. And he says that he's speaking in human terms. Well, what's he mean by that? He's not speaking. Remember, Paul was a mystic. And in 2 Corinthians, he talks about being taken up to the third heaven. So he understood the mysteries of faith in very powerful ways, but he had to express them in ways that people would understand. Remember, we go back to that GUI model, that graphic user interface. So he has to speak in ways that people will understand. So now he is saying that previously people were living in sin. And he says that they were presented parts of their bodies as slaves to impurity. And now he's telling them, and he says lawlessness. And for lawlessness. Now, he says, but now present them as slaves to righteousness for sanctification. Well, really important question to ask is, what is righteousness? And there we go. And this is really important, because obviously the word he didn't say was righteousness, because it's not a Latin word. The word, according to Clement, and it's not a Greek word, according to Clement, the word was iusticia, or iusticia. There's an old saying, I don't know if you know that, when John Paul II, when Carr was made Pope and became John Paul II, he went to sign his first document, and someone said, Your Holiness, I want to remind you there's no J in Latin. And he went, there is now. But originally it was an I. So that's why you see INRI on crosses. It means Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in Latin, but there was no J. So it was I, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So the justice actually is with an I, but it's iusticia, which means justice. But one of the words it also can mean is orthopraxis. I'll talk about that in a second, but it's justice. So it's not, righteousness is an important word if you understand the word, but it's to act in justice. In other words, to treat people as God would want you to treat them, which may sound familiar, but isn't that the commandment? Love one another as I have loved you. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So it really means to act in justice. Now, let's go back to the concept of slaves of impurity. What he's specifically talking about there is prostitution and fornication. Well, it's important to understand how this needs to be looked at. And this is why you have to be careful of the Church of Catholic teaching as a moral code. A moral code will teach you certain things are right and certain things are wrong. That's important. But St. Paul is using the term justice, and justice is built on treating other people as being children of God, as we are children of God. So it means to treat them as equals, as you would want to be treated. Remember, when we're talking the term of prostitution or even fornication, depending on the situation, you're actually talking of a superior and a junior. Someone who is a superior and someone who is inferior, or however the term, I think junior works best. Even though we're talking across gender lines, I think it works best as opposed to the term inferior. So it's not an equal relationship. And so he's calling for, and this is something that St. Paul says straight across the board, he's calling for exactly what Jesus says, treat others as you would want to be treated. That's acting in justice. And of course, the term is orthopraxis. If you've never heard the word, that's an important thing to note, Because I'm sure you listen to people say, I'm looking for someone who's going to be Orthodox in this church. I only want to go to an Orthodox priest. We're not talking about Orthodox Christianity. We're talking about a term that people use. What does orthodoxy actually mean? It means right teaching. So what is orthopraxy? Right action. And that's one of the terms that, from one of the dictionaries I checked, justice means. It means to act correctly. It means correct action. And therefore, righteousness, it's not so much, well, he's a good person, he does the right thing, the whole bit. No, it means to be treating others as God wants you to treat them. There you go. And it says righteousness for sanctification. What is sanctification? Remember what sanctification means. It's connected to the term holy. What does holy mean? Set apart. So righteousness for basically being set apart as an ambassador of the kingdom of God. So he's saying, before, you just lived however you lived within the context of the pagan community of the Romans. But now you are a servant of Christ, and therefore your focus is to act as Christ would want you to act. And how does he want you to act? Treat others as you would want them to treat you, as you are now sanctified, which means you are set apart as servants and ambassadors of the kingdom. That goes far, far, far more than a moral code. That's a real long distance of understanding what it means. So a moral code is you just do the right thing. This is what you're supposed to do. We're called to orthopraxy. We're called to act in justice. We're called to treat others as you would have others treat us. So he's saying, before you were slaves to sin, but now you are in righteousness, and you are free from righteousness. It's probably a translation problem, because it sounds like we're free. Now we don't have to be righteous either. No, we're free, and we actually should be for righteousness. Okay? So this is the whole meaning. So we looked at that. All right. We turned from sin to follow Christ. Why? So that we can be educated by his wisdom, and his wisdom teaches us how to treat others as God wants us to treat them, and he wants us to treat them as we would want to be treated. That's a whole different focus. Do you understand? So with that, we're realizing where Christ is calling us. He's calling us to a whole different focus. He's calling us to turn our lives and pursue the commandments that he is saying. But remember, the commandments, which we always think of the 10, are based on 2. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. So now your way of acting is completely different, because you're basing it on something completely different. There you go. And that also changes everything, because once you understand the way you are acting and the way you are living and the way you are being, once you understand that and you are focused on centering your life on Christ, then what you're doing is you're changing your entire way of living totally. Not just a moral way of living, a completely different way of living. I always like to know the story. And people will bring that up to me all the time, of someone who will seek to live the moral code because they believe Christianity is a moral code, but they'll treat other people improperly, and they will think that they are acting morally, and they're not. I was in a parish one time where I had English speakers and Spanish speakers. We had people from El Salvador, and we had the English. I always say the English speakers. The English speakers usually come from different countries, whereas when you're dealing with people from another country, they usually just come from that one country. So English speakers and Spanish speakers. And one of my parishioners who believed that she was morally upright all the time, was nasty to many people, regardless of what language they spoke. And one of the members of the Salvadoran community said, "I'd like to know, do the English speakers believe that feel that we are welcome here? I mean, are they welcome us here?" And then she stood up and says, "You're not welcome here at all. You don't belong here." Well, there you go. She may have lived a morality, but not a Christian morality. We'll be right back right after this. Did you know that you can listen to Catholic Audio Media on the iHeartRadio app? Catholic Audio Media is now available through your iHeartRadio app. If you don't have the app, download it to your smartphone, tablet, or computer and subscribe through the podcast tab to Catholic Audio Media. You can also enable them through your smart speaker and hear them through the smart speaker as well. Just ask for Catholic Audio Media podcast from iHeartRadio. You can hear them anywhere. You can listen to them as you're jogging. You can listen to them as you're preparing to go to bed. You can listen to them as you're eating and having breakfast or lunch or dinner. You can hear them anytime you want at iHeartRadio through the iHeartRadio app. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back, and we're talking about what Paul is directing people to. So we've seen this whole thing, okay? Now we understand, going back over the past several days, we're not called to follow the Jewish law anymore. That was there for a time, and it was there to lead us to Christ. Now Christ died and rose, so the Jewish law no longer applies for us in Christianity. It doesn't apply, because now we are saved by Jesus' death and resurrection on the cross. So we are saved by grace, and we respond to that grace. So we cooperate with that grace. So we're saved by grace, but we cooperate with that grace. And that grace is always reaching out to us, always. Even if we are rejecting God and we are far away from sin, there's the famous story, which I've talked about earlier, several weeks ago. However, whatever. Sometimes I can get lost in those words, whatever. So it was before, a few weeks ago, a few days ago, whatever. So in any case, the story of Saint Therese Lisieux, who prayed for the conversion of a condemned criminal, and he even turned away the opportunity to have last rites, but she continued praying for him, and which, by the way, is now we're talking minutes, and or maybe at most an hour. And she continued praying for him, and at virtually his last breath, he kissed the cross, indicating she understood that as a conversion. God's grace is always reaching out to us, and there is a concept out there that is completely wrong, that God, he has a limit of how much he will reach out to you. No, that's completely wrong. And there you go, kind of bringing that in. Remember how St. Paul begins this passage. And remember, this is the daily reading, so you can see this in the daily readings, and you hear it at Mass. Begins, because of your weakness, I'm going to explain this to you, in your human weakness. So in other words, I'm going to explain this to you in a way you're going to understand. So that means that when someone says, well, my understanding of God is that his mercy is limited, which we know is not Catholic teaching, that's because the person cannot grasp an understanding of unlimited mercy. Our understanding is always growing. And so therefore, because it's always growing, there is so much about God that we're learning more and more. So it's growing, we're understanding, we're deepening, we're growing in our faith. And Paul understands this as speaking to people who are new to the faith. They're not going to understand deep precepts, so he explains it in a way that they can. That, by the way, is a major history of the church. The church, many things that the church did to explain to people how they would understand. Because remember, they didn't read. One of the things I was thinking about the other day, most people never heard these scriptures. They didn't know these scriptures. They weren't reading the Bible every day because they couldn't read. And the whole concept of reading so that they could read the Bible came from the Protestant Reformation. The Pilgrims taught people to read so that they could read the Bible, and the Puritans. And that was the whole point. They needed to know how to read so that they could read the Bible. That was the whole thing. And that's when people would start to read some of these things, and then some of their teachings came out. But it's important for us to understand what Christ actually teaches, and then we go back to this message. And what does St. Paul says? I'm teaching this to you in a simple way because you're not able to understand anything bigger than that. And realize he's speaking to people that can't read either, except obviously the person that's reading the letter. Ha ha ha. So obviously you can read, otherwise how do we know the letter's there? But in any case, they couldn't read either. So they may have asked questions when Paul was preaching, they may have asked questions, none of which is in the Bible. But you have to realize that Paul is writing these to many Romans who didn't read. The church has always been preaching to people who didn't read, and so they have given people the information they could, and so there was kind of, I guess you could say, a bottleneck. I don't mean anything negative on that, of the information from the scriptures to the people, because many people couldn't read. So therefore, the priest would preach. That's where stained glass windows came from. People couldn't read, so they learned the gospel through the stained glass windows. So you see all of this coming together, and it's right there in this reading. Paul understands that people can't fully comprehend everything, so he's telling them what they can say. But now people are very upset with the bishops for taking a side on this case dealing with conversion therapy, because they believe conversion therapy causes great damage. And so, and my personal opinion is we're called to follow Christ and let Christ inform us. And that's the way I teach it. Christ inform us. That's why prayer is so essential, and that's why bringing things to prayer, that's where I always go. And I had a letter from someone the other day who is constantly being harassed. Yet he struggles and realizes he can't change his orientation. So do you see what I'm saying? And this is drawing on the fact that, as Paul says, the church for years taught only in a way people could understand. Life can be challenging, but amidst the trials and tribulations, there is wisdom to be found. Welcome to Sirach 2, a chapter filled with timeless guidance and insights from the book of Sirach. In this chapter, we learn the importance of remaining steadfast in our faith, even in the face of adversity. It teaches us to be patient, for trials can shape our character and lead to spiritual growth. Seeking wisdom and understanding is of utmost importance. Sirach 2 reminds us to study the teachings of the wise, be open to correction, and follow God's commandments. By doing so, we can find true fulfillment and blessings. Don't be discouraged by the temporary prosperity of the wicked or the challenges you may face. Trust in God's justice, for he rewards those who diligently seek him. Join us on this journey of faith as we discover the path to a meaningful and fulfilling life. Sirach 2 is your roadmap to wisdom, patience, and eternal blessings. Read Sirach 2 and let its timeless wisdom guide you through life's ups and downs. Available now in the book of Sirach, part of the Old Testament. Brought to you by the voice of St. Anthony Parish in Alston. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts, previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com, your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back, and so we've been talking about this a powerful passage from Romans 6. And so we understand that our call is to live in justice and to live in righteousness, orthopraxis. So our call is to live in ways that are what Christ calls us to do, which is why our relationship with Christ is so essential. Last Sunday, I preached about the prayer with Moses praying on the mountain, and every time he raised his hands, they'd win the battle, and every time his hands got tired and they dropped, they'd lose the battle. But what the church teaches is that's a sign of something that happened with Moses over time, where he grew in an intimate relationship with God. And therefore, when he interceded, it was as a friend of God he was interceding. And my point was that we're all called to have the same relationship. By the way, that holding up your hands to pray to God that we find in Moses eventually became part of the Mass. And that's what the priest does. And people will tell you, lay people are not allowed to do that. No, there's no liturgical rule that says you can't do that. Many people like to do it during the Our Father. Have yourself a ball. Enjoy. There is no liturgical rule that says you can't do that. There is no liturgical rule that says you can't hold hands during the Our Father either, by the way. So, but anyway, we look at that and we see that this is what the intimacy of Christ with us leads us to live as people who are serving Christ. We'll see you tomorrow. The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.